You don't need tanks rolling through the streets. You don't need soldiers kicking down doors. You don't even need a dictator standing on a balcony screaming orders. All you need is fear. Fear, confusion, and isolation. That's it. That's the recipe. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you are watching this recipe being used in real time. Totalitarianism does not require force. It requires your psychological surrender. Vaclav Havel, a man who lived under communist rule for decades, understood something that most people never will. He said the system doesn't survive because of guns. It survives because people voluntarily participate in their own oppression. They go along, they comply, they stop thinking for themselves, and the terrifying part, they don't even realize they're doing it. Fear, confusion, isolation, surrender. Today, we're going to dissect the psychology behind how totalitarianism actually works. Not the political theory, not the history books, the psychology, the mechanisms inside your own mind that make you vulnerable to it. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the most dangerous prison is the one you build for yourself. Manufactured dread. Every totalitarian system begins the same way, not with power, with anxiety. The first step is to flood the population with a sense of existential dread. Something terrible is coming. The economy is collapsing. An enemy is at the gates. A disease will kill millions. The specific threat doesn't matter. What matters is that you feel it in your bones. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. Arendt identified something critical. The goal isn't to convince you of one specific lie. The goal is to exhaust your ability to distinguish truth from falsehood entirely. When you're overwhelmed with contradictory information, when every source seems unreliable, when reality itself feels unstable, you enter a state psychologists call learned helplessness. You stop trying to figure out what's true. You stop resisting. You just want someone to tell you what to do. And that is exactly when they offer you a savior. This manufactured confusion isn't accidental. It's engineered. Matthias Desmet, a professor of clinical psychology, calls this the first condition of mass formation. A population drowning in free-floating anxiety that has no clear object, no obvious source, just a constant grinding sense that something is deeply wrong. And when you feel that way long enough, you'll grab onto anything that promises relief. But this is only the beginning. Because what happens next is far more insidious. Broken bonds. The second ingredient is isolation. Not physical isolation, though that helps. Psychological isolation. The severing of meaningful social bonds. Think about it. When was the last time you had a genuine conversation with a neighbor? When was the last time you felt part of a real community, not an online echo chamber, but an actual group of people who know your name and care about your well-being? A society of disconnected individuals is a society ready to be controlled. Desmet identified this as the second condition, a lack of social bonds. When people feel disconnected, when they lack meaningful relationships and community ties, they become psychologically vulnerable. They're searching for belonging. And totalitarian movements offer belonging on a massive scale. You're not just joining a political party, you're joining a crusade, a righteous battle against evil. Suddenly you have purpose, you have identity, you have a tribe. Belonging, purpose, identity. Now that you see this pattern of isolation breeding vulnerability, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me. There's so much more to uncover, because the next step in this process is where it gets truly disturbing. Meaningless lives. Here's the third condition, and it might be the most devastating one, a lack of meaning. Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps. He watched totalitarianism consume an entire civilization, and his conclusion, as he wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, when a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. But what happens when even the pleasures stop working? When the scrolling, the shopping, the binge-watching, the drinking, none of it fills the void anymore. You're left with what Frankl called the existential vacuum, a terrifying emptiness at the center of your life. Emptiness. And here's what most people don't understand. This emptiness isn't a personal failure, it's a societal condition. Modern life has systematically stripped meaning from daily existence. Work is often meaningless. Relationships are transactional. Community is digital and shallow. Religion has declined without anything replacing its psychological function. People without meaning will follow anyone who gives them one. When millions of people are simultaneously experiencing this void, they form a powder keg. All it takes is a single spark, a narrative, an ideology, a leader who says, I know why you're suffering, and I know who's to blame. And that brings us to the most dangerous mechanism of all, free-floating rage. The fourth condition is free-floating aggression. You're anxious, you're isolated, your life feels meaningless, and now you're angry, but you don't know who to be angry at. That's the key. The aggression is free-floating. It's not directed at anything specific. It's just there, simmering beneath the surface, looking for a target. Anger without direction, seeking target. Think about how often you feel frustrated for no clear reason. Road rage, online arguments with strangers, disproportionate reactions to minor inconveniences. That's free-floating aggression. And on a societal level, when millions of people share this condition simultaneously, something extraordinary happens. Desmet calls it mass formation. Others call it mass psychosis. The crowd becomes a single organism seeking an enemy. A narrative emerges that channels all of that undirected rage toward a specific target. The Jews, the bourgeoisie, the unvaccinated, the immigrants, the other political party. It doesn't matter who the target is. What matters is that the aggression finally has somewhere to go. The mob has many heads but no brains. And the psychological relief of having someone to blame is so intoxicating that people will defend the narrative with their lives, even when all evidence contradicts it. But what makes this mass formation so difficult to break, that's where it gets truly terrifying. The hypnosis. Mass formation functions exactly like hypnosis. This isn't a metaphor, it's a clinical observation. When a person is hypnotized, their field of attention narrows dramatically. They become laser-focused on one thing while becoming completely blind to everything else. You could stick a needle through their arm and they wouldn't feel pain. That's how powerful focused attention is. Under mass formation, the population enters a collective hypnotic state. Now scale that up to an entire society. When mass formation takes hold, people become so focused on the ideology, so consumed by the narrative, that they literally cannot see the damage it's causing. Their own suffering becomes invisible to them. Their neighbor's suffering becomes invisible. The ideology becomes more real than reality itself. This is why you can present facts, evidence, data to someone under mass formation and it does absolutely nothing. You're trying to reason with someone who is psychologically hypnotized. The information simply doesn't register. It bounces off a wall of belief that has replaced their capacity for critical thought. Blind, focused, hypnotized. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. The people under mass formation genuinely believe they are the rational ones. They think you are the one who can't see clearly. They experience their hypnosis as enlightenment. And that paradox is what makes this mechanism so incredibly dangerous to resist. Ritual sacrifice. Now here's a detail that will chill you to the bone. People under mass formation don't just tolerate suffering, they actively seek it. Desmet observed something remarkable. Once the mass formation is established, individuals willingly sacrifice their personal interests, their comfort, even their well-being for the collective narrative. Sacrifice. Why? Because the sacrifice gives them purpose. Before mass formation, their lives were meaningless. Now, every act of self-denial becomes proof of their devotion to the cause. Every hardship becomes meaningful. Every loss becomes sacred. The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. Think about the cultural revolutions, the purges, the witch hunts throughout history. People didn't just participate because they were forced. Many participated enthusiastically. They reported their own neighbors, their own family members. They destroyed the people they loved to prove their loyalty to the ideology. This is the terrifying arithmetic of totalitarianism. The individual ceases to exist. Only the collective remains, and the collective demands blood. Your identity is absorbed into the machine. Your conscience is replaced by the group's conscience. Your thoughts become the group's thoughts. And speaking of thought, what happens to the people who refuse to stop thinking for themselves? Dissent is death. Havel described a greengrocer who places a sign in his shop window that reads, "Workers of the world, unite." Does the greengrocer believe in this slogan? No, he puts it there to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to survive. Every act of compliance is a small death of the authentic self. This is what Havel called living within the lie. The entire society becomes a theater of performance. Everyone acts as if they believe. Everyone speaks the approved language. Everyone displays the approved symbols, not because they're convinced, but because the cost of dissent is destruction. Silence, compliance, survival. And this creates a devastating psychological trap. When everyone around you appears to believe the narrative, you start doubting your own perception. Am I the crazy one? Am I the only person who sees this? This is a well-documented phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. Everyone privately disagrees, but because nobody speaks up, everyone assumes they're alone in their dissent. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. The system doesn't need to silence every voice. It just needs to make the cost of speaking so high that most people choose silence voluntarily, and here's what's even more disturbing. Self-censorship is more effective than censorship, because when you censor yourself, you internalize the oppression. It becomes part of you. But is this really an inevitable cycle? The relief drug. Here's the part nobody talks about. Totalitarianism feels good, not at the beginning. At the beginning, it's terrifying. But once you surrender to the ideology, once you stop fighting and let the narrative take over, there is an enormous flood of psychological relief. Think about it. Before the ideology, you were anxious with no explanation. Now you know why you're anxious. Before, you were angry with no target. Now you have an enemy. Before, your life was meaningless. Now you're a soldier in the most important battle in history. The ideology transforms chaos into order and terror into meaning. This is why people cling to totalitarian ideologies with such ferocity. Challenging the ideology doesn't just threaten their beliefs. It threatens to return them to that unbearable state of meaningless anxiety. It threatens to take away their relief. Relief meaning purpose, belonging. Psychologically, the ideology functions exactly like an addiction. The hit of certainty, the rush of belonging, the comfort of having all the answers, take it away and you face withdrawal, existential withdrawal. The void comes rushing back. People would rather live inside a beautiful lie than face an ugly truth. And this explains why facts alone can never defeat totalitarianism. You're not fighting bad information, you're fighting a psychological survival mechanism. So what actually breaks the spell? Breaking the spell. Desmet's research offers a crucial insight. Mass formation is never total. In every totalitarian society, roughly 30% of the population is fully hypnotized, true believers. Another 40% goes along to survive. They're Havel's greengrocer. They don't believe, but they comply. And then there's the remaining 30% who resist, who continue thinking, who refuse to surrender their minds. 1. 30% true believers. 2. 40% compliant survivors. 3. 30% independent thinkers. And here's the critical finding. If the 30% who resist stop speaking, the mass formation deepens. It becomes more extreme, more violent, more totalitarian. But if they continue to speak, even at great personal cost, the mass formation cannot fully consolidate. Speak. Havel called this living in truth, not grand political revolution, not violent resistance, simply refusing to participate in the lie. The greengrocer takes down the sign. He says what he actually thinks. He stops performing. The power of the powerless lies in their refusal to live within the lie. This single act of authenticity sends shockwaves through the system because it reveals what everyone secretly knows. The emperor has no clothes. Your voice is more powerful than you have ever been told. Every person who speaks truth weakens the hypnosis. Not by convincing the true believers, that's nearly impossible, but by giving courage to the silent 40%. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Your psyche now. Everything we've discussed today isn't just history. It's happening right now, inside your mind. The question isn't whether totalitarian mechanisms exist in the modern world. They do. The question is whether you can see them operating in your own psychology. Are you anxious without knowing exactly why? Are you isolated, lacking deep community bonds? Does your life feel like it lacks genuine meaning? Are you angry at targets someone else chose for you? Anxious, isolated, meaningless, angry. If any of these resonate, you are experiencing the preconditions for mass formation. Not because you're weak, not because you're stupid, because you're human. And these are universal human vulnerabilities that every totalitarian system in history has exploited. Awareness of the mechanism is the first defense against it. The antidote is not more information. It's not finding the right ideology. The antidote is building genuine connections, finding authentic meaning, developing the courage to think independently even when everyone around you has stopped. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. Totalitarianism doesn't require tanks, it requires your psychological submission. And the moment you understand that, truly understand it, you become ungovernable. Not because you fight the system, but because you refuse to let the system live inside your mind. Vaclav Havel spent years in prison for speaking truth. Matthias Desmet faced professional destruction for naming the mechanism. Throughout history, every person who resisted mass formation paid a price, but they understood something that the compliant majority did not. Freedom costs everything. The price of compliance is your soul, not in a religious sense, in a psychological sense. Every time you repeat something you don't believe, every time you silence yourself to avoid conflict, every time you surrender your judgment to the crowd, a piece of your authentic self dies. And eventually there's nothing left, just an empty vessel carrying someone else's ideology. But it doesn't have to be that way. You now understand the mechanism. You know how fear becomes confusion, how confusion becomes isolation, how isolation becomes surrender, and how surrender feels like relief. You know the trick. And a trick that you can see can never fool you again. If you made it this far, comment ungovernable if you refuse to let any ideology possess your mind. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this opened your eyes, hit like and subscribe. Understanding yourself is the work of a lifetime. See you in the next video.